Blood drenched the emergency room floor as a ruthless syndicate boss tore through armed guards like fragile rag dolls. Doctors fled in terror. Security backed away. No man, no weapon, and no amount of sedatives could calm the feral beast of the Chicago underworld. Until a heavily overweight, exhausted night shift nurse named Callista simply reached out and held his bare, blood-stained hand. What followed wasn't just a medical miracle. It was a dangerous, twisted obsession that would bathe the city in blood. Stick around to hear a gripping story of Mafia darkness, undeniable curves, and a lethal romance. The neon lights of St. Jude's Medical Center flickered relentlessly, casting a sickly, fluorescent pallor over the emergency room triage bay. Outside, a brutal Chicago thunderstorm battered the reinforced glass windows, the rain coming down in sheets that mirrored the sheer chaos brewing within the city's criminal underbelly. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, typically a graveyard shift filled with mundane ailments, drunks, and the occasional minor car scrape. But tonight, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the metallic tang of impending violence. In the break room, Callista Evans sat heavily in a cheap plastic chair that groaned in protest under her weight. She was 28, undeniably fat, and entirely exhausted. Callista wore 2X teal scrubs that clung tightly to the thick rolls of her waist and the wide, heavy flare of her hips. Her thighs pressed firmly together, chafing beneath the cheap fabric, while her large, soft breasts strained against the V-neck collar of her uniform. She had a round, cherubic face framed by unruly curls of dark honey-brown hair, and soft dimpled hands that were currently wrapped around a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee. Callista had never been the girl who turned heads, at least not in the way society deemed desirable. She was used to the invisible nature of her existence, the way doctors looked past her broad shoulders to speak to the thinner, more conventionally attractive nurses. She was used to taking up space in a world that constantly demanded women shrink themselves. But what Callista lacked in conventional, magazine cover beauty, she made up for in an unshakable, grounding presence. She was the immovable object in the chaotic storm of the ER. "Evans, you've got 5 minutes before Dr. Costas needs you in Trauma 1, a passing orderly muttered, not even glancing up from his clipboard. Callista sighed, the sound rattling in her chest, and took a bite of a stale, powdered donut. "Copy that, David. I'm on my way." Before she could even swallow, the automatic double doors of the ambulance bay exploded open. The sheer force of the entry shattered one of the glass panes, sending glittering shards raining down onto the scuffed linoleum. The shrieks of the triage nurses pierced the quiet night. Callista dropped her coffee, the brown liquid splattering across her white clogs, and rushed out of the break room. Her heavy thighs rubbed together with rapid friction as she jogged toward the commotion, her heart hammering against her ribs. A gurney was being shoved violently through the entrance, not by paramedics, but by 4 massive men in tailored Italian suits that were ruined by dark, spreading bloodstains. They carried submachine guns openly, their faces twisted into masks of sheer, desperate panic. "Get a fucking doctor right now!" roared the largest of the men, a giant with a jagged scar running down his throat. This was Landon Brooks, the ruthless underboss of the Campbell Syndicate. "If he dies, every single one of you in white coats dies with him. Move!" At the center of the chaos, thrashing violently on the blood-soaked gurney, was Dean Campbell. Dean was a myth made flesh. The undisputed don of the Chicago Mafia, he was a towering, terrifying figure of raw, lethal muscle. Even now, with a massive gunshot wound tearing through the left side of his chest and a secondary graze across his ribbed abdomen, he was fighting like a cornered apex predator. His tailored dress shirt was ripped open, exposing a torso heavily inked with dark, intricate Mafia tattoos and slick with his own crimson blood. His eyes, a piercing, icy shade of slate grey, were completely feral. "Don't touch me!" Dean roared, his voice a gravelly, deafening thunderclap that shook the very walls of the ER. He swung a massive, bruised fist, connecting squarely with the jaw of a terrified security guard who had foolishly tried to restrain him. The guard crumpled to the floor, instantly unconscious. "Mr. Campbell, please, you're bleeding out!" Dr. Aris Costas, a brilliant but easily rattled trauma surgeon, rushed forward, holding a syringe of high-grade sedatives. "I said stay the fuck back!" Dean lunged, ignoring the tearing of his own flesh. He grabbed Dr. Costas by the collar of his white coat with a single, blood-drenched hand, lifting the doctor entirely off the ground, despite the gaping hole in his chest. "You put that needle in me, I'll carve your eyes out." "Landon, control your boss," Dr. Costas choked out, his legs kicking in the air. "No one controls Dean," Landon yelled back, keeping his gun trained on the nursing staff. "Just fix him without putting him under. Do it!" The ER was paralyzed. 2 nurses were openly weeping in the corner. Another security guard was backing away slowly, hands raised in absolute defeat. The monitors were shrieking, the machines registering Dean's skyrocketing lethal blood pressure. The mob boss was bleeding out rapidly. The slick puddle of crimson beneath the gurney was expanding by the second, yet his adrenaline-fueled rage made him completely untouchable. If he didn't calm down, he would tear his own heart apart before the surgeons could even clamp the artery. Callista stood at the edge of the room. She felt the heavy, grounded weight of her own body. She looked at the guns, the blood, and the terrifying feral man who held the life of her colleague in his massive fist. She didn't see a Mafia boss. She saw a terrified, dying animal operating purely on a fight-or-flight instinct, blinded by pain and paranoia. Without thinking, without asking for permission, Callista pushed past the line of armed mobsters. Her wide, heavy hips brushed past Landon's custom suit. "Hey, back off, fat bitch!" one of the suited men snarled, raising the barrel of his gun toward her broad chest. "Shut up and let me do my job, or your boss is dead in 60 seconds, Callista snapped back, her voice remarkably even, laced with a maternal authority that momentarily stunned the hardened killer. She stepped directly into Dean Campbell's line of sight. Dean's icy grey eyes snapped to her. He was hyperventilating, his broad, tattooed chest heaving violently, sending fresh spurts of arterial blood cascading down his torso. He still held Dr. Costas suspended by the throat, his grip unyielding. Callista didn't flinch. She didn't cower, like the thin, beautiful nurses who were currently hiding behind the supply carts. She stood squarely in front of him, her heavy body planting firmly into the ground. She took up space. She was a mountain of soft, yielding warmth in a room made of cold, sharp steel. "Dean," Callista said. Her voice was not a shout, but a rich, deep alto that cut entirely through the cacophony of shrieking monitors and shouting mobsters. Dean froze. His pupils were dilated to the very edges of his irises, completely consumed by the trauma and blood loss. He looked at her. He saw the roundness of her face, the deep, dark circles of exhaustion under her brown eyes, and the thick, sturdy build of her body. "Drop the doctor, Dean," Callista instructed, stepping 1 inch closer. She didn't look at his wound. She kept her eyes locked directly on his feral, slate-grey gaze. "He can't help you if he's dead, and you are bleeding all over my freshly mopped floor." Landon stepped forward, his gun shaking. "Hey, you better back the fuck up before I said quiet," Callista barked without breaking eye contact with Dean. Time seemed to suspend in the sterile air of the trauma bay. Dean's heavy, ragged breathing hitched. The wild, untamed fury in his eyes flickered, colliding with the absolute, unwavering calm in Callista's brown eyes. There was no fear in her expression. There was no disgust at his violent nature. There was only a deep, profound, grounding force. Slowly, agonizingly, Dean's fingers uncurled. Dr. Costas dropped to the floor, gasping and coughing for air, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. Dean swayed. The sudden release of tension allowed the immense physical trauma of his gunshot wound to finally catch up to him. His massive knees buckled. Before he could crash onto the hard linoleum, Callista stepped directly into him. She threw her thick, heavy arms around his massive torso, absorbing the shock of his weight. He was a giant of a man, heavy with muscle and bone, but Callista's sturdy, plump frame acted as a perfect, soft barricade. She grunted as his weight pressed against her large breasts and thick stomach, but she held him up, wrapping her soft, dimpled hands firmly around his broad back. "I've got you," she whispered, her breath ghosting over the sweaty, blood-matted hair at his temple. "I've got at you. You're safe." Dean's head rested heavily against the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply. Amidst the sharp smell of antiseptic, copper blood, and fear, he smelled her. She smelled like cheap vanilla body lotion, stale coffee, and something entirely intoxicatingly warm. It was the scent of safety. "My chest," he ground out, a guttural rasp that vibrated against her collarbone. "I know," Callista murmured softly, slowly guiding him backward until he was sitting on the edge of the gurney. "It hurts, but I need you to stay with me." Dr. Costas, having recovered slightly, rushed forward with the surgical team. "We need to put him under now. He's going into hypovolemic shock." "No needles!" Dean roared again, the feral energy returning as he tried to swat the doctor away. "No fucking sleep! They'll kill me!" "Dean, look at me," Callista commanded, immediately stepping between him and the needle. She reached out with both of her hands. Her fingers were thick, soft, and remarkably warm. She took his massive, heavily scarred right hand and sandwiched it between her two plump palms. She squeezed tightly. "Feel my hands," Callista ordered, her voice a soothing, rhythmic anchor. "Feel how warm they are. Squeeze my hand." Dean looked down at their joined hands. His knuckles were bruised, covered in the blood of his enemies, hard and calloused from years of ruthless violence. Enveloping his lethal fist were Callista's hands, plump, soft, unblemished, and fiercely tender. The contrast was staggering. He squeezed her hand. He squeezed it so hard that Callista felt the bones in her fingers grind together, a sharp spike of pain shooting up her forearm. But she didn't wince. She held on tighter. "Focus on me," Callista said, moving her face closer to his, so that her warm breath fanned his pale lips. "Not the doctors, not the guns. Just me. You are going to let them help you. I will hold your hand the entire time. I'm not going anywhere." Dean's slate-grey eyes searched her round, open face. He searched for a lie, for deception, for the ulterior motives he had been surrounded by his entire violent life. He found nothing but raw, honest empathy. His gaze dropped to her full lips, then down to the soft, heavy curve of her breasts pressing against his arm, and back up to her eyes. "You stay," he rasped, his voice weakening as the blood loss became critical. "I'm right here," Callista promised, rubbing her thumb over his knuckles. "Do it," Dean whispered to Dr. Costas, never once breaking eye contact with the chubby, tired nurse, holding him together. The surgeon immediately pushed the sedative into Dean's IV line. Within seconds, the heavy, dark lashes of the Mafia boss began to flutter. His body grew impossibly heavy, slumping back against the raised mattress of the gurney. But even as the powerful narcotics dragged him down into the black abyss of unconsciousness, his grip on Callista's hand remained like an iron vice. "We need to move him to the OR, now!" Dr. Costas shouted, the medical team finally springing into unhindered action. Callista tried to pull her hand away to let the surgical team pass, but Dean's unconscious grip was unbreakable. "He won't let go," Callista said, a mix of panic and awe in her voice. Landon stepped up behind her, his gun finally lowered, staring at the plump nurse with a newfound, guarded respect. "Then you're going into the operating room, sweetheart. Because if he wakes up and you aren't there, he'll burn this hospital to the ground." The surgery lasted exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. Callista remained standing in the freezing operating room the entire time, her hand trapped in the unrelenting grip of the unconscious Mafia boss. Her thick legs ached, her lower back screamed in protest, and her fingers were throbbing and purple from the sheer force of his hold. But she stayed. She watched as Dr. Costas extracted a 9mm hollow point bullet from millimeters above Dean Campbell's heart, amazed at the sheer, brutal resilience of the man on the table. When they finally transferred him to the private, highly secured VIP recovery suite on the top floor, Dean's grip loosened just enough for Callista to slip her bruised hand free. Exhausted to her very marrow, Callista clocked out as the morning sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline. She drove her beat-up Honda Civic back to her modest, cramped apartment in the South Side, peeled off her blood-stained scrubs, and stood naked in front of her bathroom mirror. She looked at her reflection. She saw the heavy rolls of her stomach, the thick width of her thighs, the stretch marks that mapped her soft skin like silvery rivers. She was fat. She knew it. Society reminded her of it daily, and the men she occasionally tried to date certainly never let her forget it. Yet the way Dean Campbell had looked at her. Callista shook her head, turning on the hot water. "He was bleeding out and hallucinating," she muttered to herself, stepping under the spray. He didn't even know what he was looking at. But 20 miles away, in a heavily guarded hospital bed, Dean Campbell was waking up. The pain was a dull, localized fire in his chest, masked by a heavy cocktail of painkillers. His eyes snapped open, immediately scanning the pristine white walls of the VIP suite. The room was empty save for Landon, who was sitting in a leather chair by the window, scrolling through a burner phone. "You're awake, boss," Landon said, instantly standing up and moving to the bedside. "Surgery was clean. Costas got the bullet. We've got 20 men locking down the floor. The Colombians don't even know you're here yet." Dean ignored the tactical report. His slate-grey eyes darted frantically around the room, his bruised hand clenching the empty white sheets of the bed. He felt an intense, hollow absence. "Where is she?" Dean's voice was a rough, sandpaper growl. Landon blinked, confused. "Who? The Colombians?" "The nurse," Dean snarled, attempting to sit up before a sharp spike of pain forced him back down. "The woman with the brown eyes. The one who held my hand. Where is she?" Landon sighed, waving a dismissive hand. Oh, the heavy girl. I think her shift ended. She went home, boss. Look, we need to talk about retaliation. In a flash of blinding speed that defied his severe injuries, Dean's hand shot out, grabbing Landon by the silk tie and yanking his underboss down so their faces were mere inches apart. The heart monitor beside the bed spiked violently. "Do not ever refer to her like that again," Dean hissed, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, possessive fury that Landon had only ever seen reserved for Dean's most hated enemies. "She is a goddess. She walked into a room full of loaded guns and tamed a fucking war. She is the only reason I am breathing right now. You will speak of her with respect, Landon. Do you understand me?" Landon swallowed hard, his hands raised in surrender. "I understand, boss. I'm sorry. I understand." Dean shoved Landon backward, his chest heaving as he fought to regulate his breathing. The memory of Callista was burned into his retinas. He remembered the incredible, grounding weight of her body against his. He remembered the softness of her enormous, beautiful breasts pressing into his arm, the absolute fearlessness in her warm brown eyes, and the way her plump, thick fingers had swallowed his calloused knuckles. In a life defined by sharp edges, cold steel, and starvation, she was an absolute feast of warmth and softness. He didn't just want her. A dark, feral beast inside him recognized her as his. "Find out her name," Dean commanded, leaning his head back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling. "Find out where she lives. Find out every single detail of her life from the day she was born." "And then?" Landon asked cautiously, straightening his ruined tie. Dean's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile. "And then, you bring her to me. She told me she wasn't going anywhere. I intend to hold her to that." Later that afternoon, Callista was rudely awakened by a frantic, aggressive pounding on her apartment door. She groaned, rolling over in her small bed, her heavy limbs tangling in the cheap cotton sheets. She glanced at the clock. 3 p.m. She had only been asleep for 6 hours. "I swear to God, Mr. Henderson, if you're asking for the rent early again, I'm calling the city inspector about the black mold," Callista yelled, wrapping a thick, worn-out pink bathrobe tightly around her generous curves. She tied the belt snugly beneath her large breasts, her messy curls piled haphazardly on top of her head. She unbolted the door and yanked it open, fully prepared to berate her sleazy slumlord apartment manager. Instead, the words died in her throat. Standing in the dingy, poorly lit hallway of her Southside complex was Landon Brooks, flanked by 2 towering mountains of muscle in immaculate black suits. Landon looked terribly out of place in the run-down building, his bespoke suit sharp, his shoes gleaming, holding a massive, obnoxious bouquet of 24 black roses. Callista instinctively pulled the lapels of her bathrobe tighter across her chest, her heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She recognized him instantly. The scar, the eyes, the mobster from the hospital. "Miss Evans," Landon said, offering a tight, polite smile that didn't quite reach his cold eyes. He held out the black roses. "Mr. Campbell requests your presence for dinner tonight, and he does not take no for an answer." Callista stared at the massive bouquet of black roses, her mind stalling as she processed the sheer absurdity of the situation. The hallway of her apartment building smelled faintly of old cabbage and damp carpet, contrasting violently with the sharp, expensive scent of Landon's custom-tailored suit and the rich, velvety fragrance of the rare blooms. "Mr. Brooks, is it?" Callista asked, keeping her thick arm firmly braced against the doorframe. ensuring the gap remained entirely blocked by her wide frame. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm exhausted. I just worked a 12-hour shift, part of which involved keeping your boss from bleeding out on my floor. I am going back to sleep." She moved to shut the door, but one of the hulking bodyguards simply planted a massive, leather-clad hand against the cheap wood. The door didn't budge an inch. Landon's polite smile vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating mask of a syndicate underboss. "Ms. Evans, you misunderstand. This was not an invitation you can RSVP to. Dean Campbell discharged himself from St. Jude's 2 hours ago against medical advice. He is currently at his penthouse in severe pain and refusing to let his private medical team change his dressings until you arrive. He wants you." Callista's jaw dropped. "He left the hospital. He had a bullet pulled from his chest wall 12 hours ago. That is a death wish." "Which is exactly why you need to get dressed," Landon stated smoothly, stepping back and gesturing towards the stairwell. "There is a black armored SUV parked out front. You have 20 minutes to shower and put on whatever makes you comfortable. If you do not come willingly, I have strict orders to throw you over my shoulder and carry you down the stairs. Do not make me do that, Ms. Evans. You are a sturdy woman. It would be difficult for both of us." A flush of deep, heated embarrassment crept up Callista's plump neck, instantly followed by a spark of pure, unadulterated anger. She was tired of men looking at her body as a burden, an obstacle, or a joke. But beneath the anger, the nurse in her panicked. If Dean Campbell tore his stitches, the internal hemorrhaging would kill him in minutes. "Give me 15 minutes, Callista snapped, snatching the black roses from Landon's hands. "And tell your gorillas to step away from my door." She slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt with trembling fingers. She didn't have time to overthink. She tossed the roses onto her cramped kitchen counter, rushed into her bedroom, and threw open her closet. She owned nothing suitable for a Mafia Don's dinner table. Bypassing her worn-out jeans, she settled on a simple, deep burgundy wrap dress. The fabric was stretchy and soft, clinging tightly to the wide flare of her hips and the thick, heavy rolls of her stomach, while the deep V-neck accommodated the heavy swell of her large breasts. She slipped on a pair of comfortable black flats, dragged a brush through her wild honey-brown curls, and swiped on a thin layer of lip gloss. When she emerged from the building, the rain had stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and glittering under the streetlights. Landon opened the heavy door of the armored SUV, and Callista awkwardly hoisted her thick thighs into the back seat, hyper-aware of the space she took up. The drive to the Gold Coast was tense and silent. When the SUV finally descended into a subterranean, highly fortified parking garage beneath a towering glass skyscraper, Callista's stomach tied itself into heavy, anxious knots. She was escorted onto a private elevator that rocketed up to the penthouse level, her ears popping from the sudden change in altitude. The doors slid open, revealing an expansive, breathtaking space of dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline and cold grey marble floors. Heavily armed guards stood like statues in the corners of the massive living room. At the center of the room, sitting in a plush leather armchair by a roaring fireplace, was Dean Campbell. He was out of his bloody hospital clothes, dressed in loose black silk pajama pants that hung off his narrow hips. His heavily tattooed, violently scarred torso was entirely bare, save for the thick white bandages wrapping around his left pectoral and ribs. He looked exhausted, his skin dangerously pale, dark circles bruising the skin under his slate-grey eyes. Yet the moment the elevator chimed, his head snapped up, and the feral apex predator energy radiating from him filled the massive room. "Leave us," Dean growled, his voice a gravelly rumble that echoed off the high ceilings. Landon and the guards instantly vanished, melting into the shadows and closing the heavy double doors behind them. Callista stood frozen on the marble floor. She felt impossibly large, out of place, and entirely exposed in her cheap burgundy dress. She instinctively crossed her arms beneath her heavy breasts, a defensive posture she had adopted since she was a teenager to try and shrink herself. Dean's eyes tracked the movement. He leaned forward slowly, a grimace of pain flashing across his sharp jawline as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Drop your arms, Callista," Dean commanded softly, his slate-grey eyes entirely consumed by a dark, burning intensity. "Do not hide yourself from me." Callista's breath hitched. Hearing her name in that rough, commanding voice sent an involuntary shiver rolling down her spine. "You shouldn't be out of the hospital, Mr. Campbell. You are risking massive infection and internal bleeding." "Dean," he corrected, his gaze slowly, deliberately traveling down the thick, soft curve of her neck, over the heavy swell of her cleavage straining against the burgundy fabric, down to the wide, plush flare of her hips, and the thick, sturdy thighs standing firmly on his marble floor. He looked at her, as if she were a feast, and he had been starving for a decade. "And I don't give a damn about the hospital. I couldn't sleep. The bed was too cold, the room was too quiet. I needed you." Callista swallowed hard, trying to maintain her professional detachment. She walked slowly toward him, her soft flats making no sound on the expensive flooring. "I am a nurse, Dean, not a sleep aid. Landon said you refuse to let your medical team change your dressings." "They have cold hands," Dean replied simply, staring up at her as she finally reached his chair. "Your hands are warm." Callista looked down at him. Without the chaos of the emergency room, she could truly see the lethal beauty of the man. His jaw was chiseled granite, his nose slightly crooked from a past break, and his tattoos were a dark tapestry of violence, loyalty, and power. Yet he was looking at her with a raw, terrifying vulnerability that completely disarmed her. "Let me see the bandages," she sighed, her maternal instinct completely overriding her fear. Dean leaned back against the leather, his eyes never leaving her face. Callista reached out, her thick, dimpled fingers gently ghosting over the edge of his medical tape. The moment her warm, soft skin made contact with his cold, clammy chest, a deep, rumbling groan vibrated in Dean's throat. He closed his eyes, his massive chest rising and falling heavily. "Your temperature is slightly elevated," Callista murmured, carefully peeling back the tape to inspect the sutured wound. The entry point was bruised a dark, angry purple, but there were no signs of active bleeding. "You are pushing your luck, Dean. The stitches are holding, but if you twist the wrong way, you will rip them open. Then you will just have to stay and sew me back together," he whispered, his eyes snapping open. Before Callista could pull her hand away, Dean's large, calloused hand shot out, capturing her thick wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to bruise, but the grip was absolute, an immovable anchor. He pulled her hand down, pressing her warm, soft palm flat against the center of his chest, right over his violently beating heart. "Do you feel that, Callista?" Dean asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate timbre. "Do you feel how fast it beats for you?" Callista's heart hammered against her own ribs, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the heavy, thumping pulse beneath her palm. The heat radiating from Dean's bare skin was intoxicating. She tried to pull her hand back, but his grip remained unyielding. "Dean, please," Callista whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't belong here. I'm just a nurse. I live in a crappy apartment, I eat vending machine food, and I don't fit in this world. Look at me." "I'm looking at—" Dean growled, his grip on her wrist shifting as he laced his long, scarred fingers through her thick, plump ones. "I have been looking at you since the second you shoved past a wall of loaded guns and told a room full of killers to shut the fuck up. You think I care about where you live? You think I give a damn about anything other than the fact that you anchored me to this earth when I was ready to leave it?" He pulled her closer, the sheer strength in his injured arm terrifying. Callista stumbled forward, her wide hips bumping lightly against the edge of his leather chair. She was forced to brace her free hand on the armrest to keep from falling directly into his lap. She was entirely caged in by his massive frame. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by hard, sharp, ruthless things," Dean said, his gaze dropping to the soft, heavy curve of her stomach, pressing against the armrest, then traveling back up to her flushed, round cheeks. "I am surrounded by thin, sharp women who want my money, and hard, sharp men who want my life. But you are entirely soft. You are warm. You are absolute perfection, Callista." A heavy, aching heat coiled low in Callista's belly. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this. Nobody had ever looked at the thick rolls of her body and seen a sanctuary. Society had spent 28 years telling her she was too much, too big, too loud, too heavy. But in Dean Campbell's slate-grey eyes, her size wasn't a flaw. It was a religion. "I saved your life," Callista managed to say, her breath hitching as Dean's thumb slowly stroked the sensitive skin of her inner wrist. "That doesn't mean you own me." "In my world, it does," Dean stated, a terrifying, possessive finality in his tone. "A life for a life. You saved mine, so now yours belongs to me. You are never going back to that cheap apartment, Callista. You are never wearing those hideous, scratchy scrubs again. You are mine to protect, mine to feed, mine to worship." "You are insane," Callista gasped, though she made no further effort to pull away. The magnetic pull of his dominance was overwhelming, a tidal wave crashing against the walls she had spent years building. "Probably," Dean conceded, a dark, wicked smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. He suddenly released her hand, gripping her heavy, flared hips with both of his massive hands. Callista gasped aloud as his large fingers dug possessively into the thick, yielding flesh of her hips, his thumbs brushing against the soft curve of her belly. He groaned softly, closing his eyes as if the mere texture of her body was a narcotic. "So soft," he murmured reverently, resting his forehead against the heavy swell of her breasts, right over the neckline of her burgundy dress. "Dio, you are so incredibly soft." Callista's knees weakened. Her thick thighs trembled under the weight of his worship. She tentatively reached up, her soft fingers sinking into his thick, dark hair. Dean leaned into the touch instantly, a feral beast entirely domesticated by the gentle stroke of a chubby, exhausted nurse. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knock shattered the intimate silence of the room. Dean's eyes snapped open, the vulnerability vanishing instantly, replaced by lethal, ice-cold fury. He released her hips, his hand flying instinctively to the 9mm pistol resting on the small table beside his chair. "What?" Dean roared, the sound causing Callista to jump back, her heart leaping into her throat. The heavy oak doors cracked open, and Landon stepped into the room, his face pale and tight with anxiety. He deliberately kept his eyes locked on Dean, pointedly ignoring the flushed, heavy-breathing woman standing entirely too close to the boss. "Boss, I apologize for the interruption," Landon said, his voice clipped and urgent. "But we have a problem." The Colombians just hit one of our shipments at the docks. 3 of our men are dead. They know you are injured. They are making a move on the southern territory." Dean's jaw clenched so tightly, Callista heard the faint pop of the joint. The air in the penthouse instantly dropped 10 degrees, heavy with the promise of extreme, unrelenting violence. The romantic, obsessive man who had just been worshipping at Callista's waist disappeared, replaced entirely by the ruthless don of the Campbell Syndicate. "Get the capos on the encrypted line," Dean ordered, slowly pushing himself up from the armchair. "Dean, stop!" Callista yelled, her medical instincts overriding her fear as she watched his injured chest flex violently. "You cannot stand up. Your blood pressure is going to spike, and you will rupture your internal sutures." Dean ignored her, fully standing up to his towering height. He took one step toward Landon before his face went deathly pale. A sharp, guttural hiss of pain tore through his teeth, and his massive knees buckled beneath him. "Boss!" Landon shouted, rushing forward, but Callista was already there. Moving with surprising speed for her heavy frame, she threw her thick arms around Dean's torso just as he began to fall. The sheer weight of him nearly brought her to the marble floor, but she widened her stance, planting her thick thighs solidly, acting once again as the soft, immovable barricade between him and the hard ground. "I've got you," Callista grunted, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist and bearing his weight against her soft, heavy chest. "I told you, you stubborn idiot. I've got you." Dean leaned heavily against her, his forehead resting in the crook of her neck, his breathing ragged. Even amidst the blinding pain of his torn muscles, he buried his face in the soft, warm curve of her shoulder, inhaling the scent of vanilla and panic. "See, Landon," Dean ground out, a dark, breathless chuckle vibrating against Callista's collarbone. "She's never leaving. She just caught me again." Callista struggled to support his weight, glaring daggers at Landon. "Don't just stand there. Help me get him back in the chair before he bleeds out again." As Landon rushed forward to take Dean's other side, the velvet trap snapped completely shut around Callista. She was no longer just a bystander who had saved a man in an emergency room. She was holding the most dangerous man in Chicago in her arms, and as the storm of a brutal mob war began to rage outside the penthouse windows, she realized with terrifying clarity that he was never, ever going to let her go. For 2 weeks, the penthouse in the Gold Coast became Callista's entire universe. It was a gilded cage of cold marble and bulletproof glass, completely isolated from the violent storm brewing on the streets of Chicago. She had not returned to her cramped apartment. She had not clocked in for a single shift at St. Jude's Medical Center. Dean Campbell had simply erased her old life with the wave of a calloused hand. Her landlord was paid off, her belongings were quietly moved, and her resignation was submitted by a terrifyingly polite mob lawyer. In exchange, Dean wrapped her in a cocoon of unimaginable luxury and suffocating obsession. He didn't just accept her fat body. He fundamentally worshipped it. The fashion industry spent billions trying to convince women like Callista to shrink, but Dean Campbell brought tailors to the penthouse to drape her thick, heavy curves in custom-made Italian silks and rich velvets. He ordered dresses that hugged the wide flare of her hips and accentuated the deep, heavy plunge of her large breasts. When she walked through the sprawling living room, her thick thighs rubbing together in a soft, rhythmic friction, his slate-grey eyes tracked her every movement with the desperate, starving intensity of a predator who had finally found his permanent feast. "You look beautiful," Dean rasped one evening, his voice a low rumble over the crackle of the fireplace. He was sitting in his leather armchair, the bandages around his chest finally reduced to thin gauze. The wound was healing rapidly, a testament to his brutal resilience and Callista's meticulous daily medical care. Callista stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering city grid. She was wearing a deep emerald silk robe that cascaded over her heavy stomach and pooled around her thick calves. She crossed her plump arms over her chest, the fabric pulling tightly across her broad shoulders. "This isn't real, Dean," Callista whispered, her brown eyes tracing the tail lights on the interstate below. "I am a hostage wrapped in silk. You're fighting a war with the Colombians, and I am just playing house. What happens when you get bored of me? What happens when you realize I'm not some mobster's trophy wife?" Dean stood up. He moved silently across the marble, wrapping his massive, heavily tattooed arms around her thick waist from behind. He pressed his chest against her broad back, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled the scent of her skin, no longer cheap vanilla lotion, but the rich, heady jasmine perfume he had bought for her. "I have never been bored a single second since you walked into that trauma bay," he murmured, his hands sliding up to cup the heavy, soft weight of her breasts. "You think I want a trophy? Trophies are hollow, fragile things. You are an anchor, Callista. You are solid, warm, and real. You are the only real thing in my life." Before Callista could lean back into his intoxicating heat, the heavy double doors of the living room burst open. Landon marched in, his face a grim mask of barely contained panic. His bespoke suit was rumpled, and there was a fresh, bloody scrape across his jawline. Behind him, two enforcers dragged a bruised, weeping man across the polished marble floor. Callista gasped, instinctively trying to step away, but Dean's grip on her waist tightened like a vice, holding her firmly against his side. He didn't flinch. The tender, worshipping lover vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless, cold-blooded Don of the Syndicate. "What is this, Landon?" Dean growled, his slate-grey eyes locking onto the trembling man on the floor. "We found the leak, boss," Landon spat, kicking the man squarely in the ribs. The man howled in pain, curling into a tight, pathetic ball. The Colombians didn't just guess where our shipments were. Someone was selling them our movements, and worse, someone sold them her. Landon pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Callista. Callista felt the blood drain from her round face. She looked closer at the sobbing, bloody man on the floor. Beneath the swelling and the bruises, she recognized the faded blue scrubs of St. Jude's Medical Center. "David?" Callista breathed, her voice trembling. It was the orderly from the break room, the man who had callously told her she had 5 minutes to get to trauma the night Dean was brought in. David looked up, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "Callista, please, please tell them. Tell them I didn't know. I just needed the money." Dean's entire body went rigid. The air in the penthouse became so thick and heavy with murderous intent that Callista struggled to draw a breath. "You sold her name to Mateo Vargas." Dean's voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifyingly quiet, hollow whisper that promised absolute agony. "They paid me 10 grand for the security footage," David sobbed, spitting blood onto the marble. "Vargas wanted to know who calmed the beast of Chicago. They wanted your weakness, Campbell. They said if they took the fat nurse, you would surrender the southern ports. I didn't know they were going to kill her." Dean released Callista's waist. He walked slowly, methodically, toward David. Every step echoed like a death knell in the massive room. "Dean, wait!" Callista choked out, her medical instincts warring with the cold reality of the underworld. "Don't do this here. Cover your eyes, Callista, Dean ordered softly, never looking back. He didn't pull his gun. He reached down with his massive, calloused hands, grabbing David by the collar of his scrubs. With a terrifying display of raw, brutal strength that completely ignored his healing chest wound, Dean lifted the orderly entirely off the floor. "I don't have weaknesses," Dean hissed into David's face, his eyes devoid of all humanity. "I have a queen, and you just put a target on her back." A sudden, deafening explosion rocked the penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows shattered inward, raining thousands of razor-sharp shards of glass across the marble floor. The shockwave threw Landon backward, and the alarm system shrieked to life, bathing the expansive living room in a pulsing, bloody crimson light. Mateo Vargas hadn't just bought Callista's name. He had bought the security bypass codes to the building. The Colombians had breached the gilded cage. The penthouse instantly descended into absolute, deafening chaos. Heavily armed Colombian cartel sicarios poured through the breached private elevator doors and rappelled down from the roof into the shattered windows. Gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks of automatic rifles tearing through the expensive Italian leather furniture and destroying the priceless artwork on the walls. Dean dropped the orderly, who was immediately gunned down in the crossfire, and lunged toward Callista. "Get down!" he roared, tackling her heavily to the marble floor. His massive body covered hers completely, his broad, tattooed back shielding her thick, soft frame from the hail of bullets. Callista squeezed her eyes shut, her large breasts pressed flat against the cold floor, her heavy thighs tangled with Dean's muscular legs. The noise was unbearable. Men screaming, glass crunching, marble exploding into dust. Dean drew the heavy 9mm pistol from the waistband of his sweatpants. He rolled off her slightly, bracing his elbow on the ground, and began returning fire with lethal, terrifying precision. Every time his gun barked, a Colombian hit the floor. "Landon, secure the perimeter!" Dean shouted, dropping an empty magazine and seamlessly sliding a fresh one into the grip. "There are too many, boss!" Landon yelled back from behind an overturned marble dining table, firing his own weapon into the smoke-filled hallway. "They breached the lower stairwell! We have to move!" Dean grunted, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth. Callista's eyes snapped open. Even in the dim, pulsing red light of the alarms, she saw the dark, wet stain spreading across the thin white gauze on Dean's chest. The violent tackle had ripped his internal sutures right open. He was hemorrhaging again. "Dean, you're bleeding!" Callista screamed over the gunfire, reaching out with her thick, dimpled hands to press against his chest. "I don't care," he snarled, his eyes completely feral as he shot another Sicario dead in the center of the room. "I'm getting you out of here." He grabbed her thick wrist, pulling her up. "Run to the reinforced panic room down the hall. Do not stop until the steel door locks." "I am not leaving you!" Callista yelled, her fear suddenly burning away, replaced by the same fierce, immovable stubbornness that had allowed her to stand her ground in the emergency room weeks ago. She was a woman who took up space, and she refused to shrink away in the face of death. A cartel heavily armored enforcer stepped through the shattered window, raising a shotgun directly at Dean's exposed back. Callista didn't think. Driven by pure adrenaline and the heavy, undeniable weight of her own body, she threw her entire frame forward. Her broad shoulder slammed squarely into Dean's waist, tackling the giant Mafia boss out of the line of fire, just as the shotgun blasted a crater into the floor where he had been standing. They crashed behind a massive oak bookshelf. Callista landed heavily on top of him, her plump, soft thighs pinning his legs, her large breasts crushing against his bleeding chest. She was out of breath, her honey-brown curls plastered to her sweaty forehead, but her brown eyes were burning with raw defiance. Dean stared up at her. Surrounded by death, gunpowder, and the absolute destruction of his empire, he looked at the fat, exhausted, beautiful nurse, pinning him to the ground, and he smiled. It was a terrifying, blood-stained, obsessive smile. "You magnificent creature," he breathed, reaching up to cup her round, flushed cheek with a blood-slicked hand. He shoved the bookcase forward with his heavy boots, crushing the cartel enforcer on the other side. With a primal roar, Dean surged upward, dragging Callista with him. The remaining syndicate guards rallied behind Landon, creating a wall of covering fire that allowed Dean to pull Callista down the hallway and into the impenetrable steel panic room. The heavy vault door slammed shut, locking with a definitive hydraulic hiss. The sound of gunfire instantly became a muted, distant thud. The room was brightly lit, lined with monitors displaying the carnage outside, stocked with weapons and medical supplies. Dean leaned against the cold steel wall, his chest heaving violently, blood pouring freely down his tattooed torso, soaking the waistband of his pants. He slid slowly down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, a dark puddle pooling beneath him. "The med kit," Callista gasped, her thick chest heaving as she scrambled toward the metal cabinets. She tore open the emergency surgical supplies, her hands shaking, but her training kicking in. She dropped to her heavy knees right in the puddle of his blood, completely ruining her custom emerald silk robe. She didn't care. She tore the ruined gauze from his chest, exposing the violently torn flesh. "You ripped the artery clamp," she panted, applying immense, heavy pressure with both of her plump hands directly onto his chest. "I have to stitch this right now, without anesthetic, or you will die in this room." Dean looked at her. He didn't look at the needle. He didn't look at the blood. He looked at the fierce, unwavering determination in her round face. He looked at the thick, sturdy thighs kneeling in his blood to save him for a second time. "Do it," he rasped, his head falling back against the steel wall. Callista worked with brutal efficiency. She used her heavy body weight to brace him against the wall, her soft, warm hands moving with practiced, frantic precision as she threaded the needle and sewed the mob boss back together, while a war raged on the other side of the door. When she finally tied off the last suture, she collapsed backward, her thick chest rising and falling heavily. Her hands were stained crimson. Her emerald dress was ruined. Dean slowly pushed himself up, wincing as the fresh stitches pulled tight. He crawled across the floor, closing the distance between them. He reached out, taking her bloody, trembling hands in his own massive ones. "You asked what happens when I realize you aren't a trophy wife," Dean whispered, his slate-grey eyes burning with absolute worship as he looked at the heavy, beautiful woman who had just dragged him through hell. "I always knew you weren't a trophy, Callista. You are a warrior. You are my queen. And this world, this violent, bloody world, it belongs to you now, just as much as I do." Callista looked at his bruised, calloused hands, enveloping her thick, dimpled ones. She thought of the cold, sterile hospital. She thought of a society that told her she was too big to be loved. Then she looked at the feral, terrifying Mafia Don kneeling in his own blood, looking at her like she was the only god he would ever pray to. The fear melted away, leaving behind a dark, heavy warmth. She didn't want to shrink anymore. She wanted to reign. Callista leaned forward, pressing her soft, full lips fiercely against Dean's scarred mouth. It tasted like copper, smoke, and absolute devotion. He groaned, his massive arms wrapping around her thick, heavy curves, pulling her flush against his chest, completely surrendering the beast of Chicago to the chubby nurse who had finally anchored his soul. Will Callista survive the dangerous, intoxicating world of the Campbell Syndicate? Or will Dean's dark, possessive obsession consume them both in a storm of mafia violence and undeniable passion? The contrast between his lethal dominance and her soft, unwavering strength is about to set the underworld on fire. If you loved this intense, pulse-pounding mafia romance, don't forget to smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on Callista and Dean, share this story with your fellow romance addicts, and subscribe for the explosive next chapters. Main characters, Dean Campbell, Callista Evans, Landon Brooks.